3, 2, and 1.
All right, good evening and welcome to the Wednesday, September 30th, 2020 special Board of Education meeting. This is an open work session for the Board of Education. In accordance with Section 7E of the Illinois Open Meetings Act, the board president and the superintendent have determined that in-person attendance by the public at the meeting is not practical, prudent, or feasible due to COVID-19 considerations, including difficulty in maintaining appropriate social distancing in the meeting room and thereby in nearby spaces, given the potential number of persons who are likely to attend and seek to engage in public participation. Public viewing and participation is available by electronic means by clicking the video button on board docs. And board members will be physically present at the meeting unless permitted to participate by electronic means in accordance with Board Policy 2220. So I will do a roll call. So Dr. Harrell?
Present.
Mr. Collins? Mrs. Hostler?
Present.
Mrs. Troutman?
Here.
Mrs. Stufen?
Present.
Okay, and Mr. Kaczynski is absent this evening. Okay, so we have 6 board members present, 1 absent, and at this time we'll stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, so we're going to start tonight with, we're going to dig right into our discussion, and we will do public comment at the end of the meeting. So just very briefly, we actually been talking months and months ago, which feels like a decade ago because of COVID, about looking at how do we measure student success, and also how do we measure district success. And we have called those key performance indicators. And we had wanted to have this conversation and do some of this work earlier, and we put it to the side due to COVID. So even though COVID is still going on, and we will have that with us for the, not sure, we're going to still, the work of the board has to continue. And it's actually, in this time of COVID, while sometimes it's hard to think about anything else, it's also driving us to be laser focused on what's really important and be nimble as an organization. So tonight, we anticipate this is part 1 of a 2-part discussion, with the second part coming in October. We're going to try to stick to a 2.5-hour meeting just for our own fatigue levels, but and then we'll finish what we don't get done at a later date. So we're going to talk about how we measure student growth and district performance, and we have a couple of facilitators here to kind of lead the conversation so that the board and the administration can discuss and come to some conclusions or define where we want to go. So we have Dr. Steve Humphrey and John Gata, and they're both from ECRA Group. And I think from this point, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think, Dr. Humphrey, you're going to start off.
Super. Well, thanks for the time to be here tonight. After all the years of doing this and helping everybody else get their microphones on, thank you. We're excited to be here tonight with you as we work through where you're headed as a board, as a district. You've had tremendous direction over the years. This is not something new. This is not something that is a major course correction. I look at it as sort of an enhancement of what's next and how do you transition to the next level that you're desiring to be in. John and I thought about talking a little bit about some of the things that you might want to consider, particularly at a national scope. And then we want to get very quickly into how you're looking at things here. And I look at this as this is your project. So I'm not going to be presenting to you. I'm not going to be lecturing to you as much as I like to do that. But rather try to get from you what you're thinking about and how you're looking at some of the things. I don't have a good sense of how much you've talked about your vision and your objectives and your key performance indicators. So if we're digging in the wrong hole, just say something and we'll go a different direction, because it is your work. And if you want to change topics or talk more in depth about something, just say so. This is a conversation tonight. We didn't bring the typical PowerPoint stuff. Just thought that's sometimes overdone. It gets in the way of conversation and things that people want to talk about, and we're not presenting. So trying to clarify where you're at. But this time I'll turn a portion of this over to Dr. John Gatta, our CEO of ECRA Group.
Thanks, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is John Gatta. As Steve said, I'm the CEO of ECRA Group. I'm also a professor at Northwestern University in predictive analytics and machine learning and other kind of data science areas. And so my role here tonight is I'm going to start by giving sort of a framework of evidence-based governance and why this work is really important, really short. But my role here tonight is sort of expert support and to guide the conversation and help move the conversation if you get stuck on certain pieces. We've done, and I personally have done a lot of work nationally on measurement of student success, how we measure student growth, how we measure outcomes at both an individual student level, at a system level, and how you turn vision into observable indicators. And that's pretty much sort of what we're talking about here today. The important thing, the motivation for all of this is what I'm calling evidence-based governance. And so as a school board, right, all of you were elected to represent the values of the community and govern this school system accordingly, right? And so it is sort of uniquely on the board's plate to ensure that the vision of the school district and ultimately how the school district defines success and ultimately how the school district judges whether they're moving in a favorable direction, right, is really the work of the school board to encapsulate the values of the community as the elected representatives, to chart a clear and compelling vision for student success, right, and then to turn that vision of student success into a set of, whether you call them key performance indicators, whether you call them strategic indicators, a collection of indicators, metrics, benchmarks that represent your vision. And I think if you go through this process, which we're going to start tonight, a sense of clarity will come over you in terms of what your sort of governance role is as a board. Because as you talk about the various areas, and tonight the focus is going to be student success and the vision for student success, but ultimately you will have to go to other areas like the learning environment and finance and operations, or however you choose to package that in terms of the total scope of indicators. But in our experience, once you've finished this process and you have a set of strategic indicators / key performance indicators, right, that represent your vision, it will become much easier to align the organization because those cascade all the way down, right? So if you establish the key performance indicators here as a Board of Education, that cascades and now drives all the school improvement initiatives because they have to tie to those strategic indicators, right? You don't go through this exercise of creating a vision, creating a set of indicators, and then not aligning the rest of the organization to that. So by setting those key performance indicators, you're essentially aligning the entire school system to say, this is how we define quality, this is how we define or operationalize our vision, this is how we're going to govern the school system through these indicators. And so as we have conversations, we're going to structure those conversations around these indicators because that represents the vision and that encapsulates the values of the community. And so that's the process we're going to start tonight. posing questions. We're assuming nothing, right? We're assuming that you don't have anything. We can move as fast or as slow as you need to. Steve will be more of a facilitator role. I will be more of a consultative role, and that's how we will play off of each other a little bit. And, you know,
We
with that.
can entertain sometimes too, so we're pretty good at that. And we find
I'm
that,
much
you know,
better without a mask because you can't see how animated my face is right now. But I think it helps, and I'm just going to motivate with a few other examples from other industries, just to kind of get you thinking, right, about what, you know, why metrics are important, why key performance indicators are important, and how they create this sense of clarity, right? Because you can look to other industries; they've been doing this for a long time, right? And so, a lot of talk about the airlines right now, right? So, I mean, they're in trouble for a lot of reasons, but you know, they have very clean strategic metrics too. One of them, and key performance indicators tend to be simple. The computations could get a little bit complex, but what they represent is incredibly simple. So take airlines. One of the metrics that they always monitor, percent of on-time arrivals. Real simple, right? But that is so fundamentally tied to the mission of an airline. You know, how can we get people from point A to point B safely and predictably? Percent of on-time arrivals, right? And that's just a key performance indicator or a strategic indicator that every single person in a management capacity within an airline knows the value. You cannot walk through any department of an airline that has any sort of leadership or an executive, and they know that number, right? And so those of you that watch CNBC, if you ever watch the show The Profit with Marcus Lemonis, he's always got that great quote. You know, it's kind of a fun little anecdote. If you don't know your numbers, you don't know your business, period, right? And so the idea here is not only are you going to establish key performance indicators, you're going to make sure that everybody in a leadership position or board knows those numbers, right? And knows where the goals are and knows what the benchmarks are, because that's what drives the entire organization, right? So that's the example. I sit on the healthcare board of Northwest Community Hospital as well, where I actually chair the whole governance committee for the quality indicators of the hospital. There's lots of key performance indicators that we monitor, but a simple one, readmittance rate, right? What percentage, you know, of patients return back to the hospital? Very simple, but very strategic indicator because it represents the quality of the organization, right? That's what we're after. That's the end goal here. Can we come up with a set of manageable indicators that represent a vision for student success, a vision for the learning environment, a vision for finance and operations? We'll have discussions about how you compartmentalize those pieces, but that's the goal. You know, that's the goal. And just the act of committing to those outcomes sends powerful messages throughout the organization. Because pick your cliche, you are what you measure, what gets measured, what gets done. It's a reality, right? The information that we choose to focus on and talk about as board members, as leaders, as administrators, that cascades and sends very powerful messages throughout the school system. So if you establish these indicators, and part of the conversation around improvement includes these indicators, and you always come back to these indicators as part of the way that you structure dialogue and structure the conversation around improvement, you're going to see how aligned the organization gets real fast, because it's just a basic sort of universal principle. Once the organization knows, wow, these outcomes are important. Wow, everybody's talking about these outcomes. Wow, this is part of every conversation. Wow, they're really committed to a direction. You don't have to tell anybody what direction to walk or move. Everybody just aligns. And when I say that there's a sense of clarity then that comes through the Board of Education is, I think you'll be relieved that once you have that visibility, you don't feel the need to go, I'll use the word exploring, in all the little minutiae and corners of all the different things that are going on within the district and all the details of every program and every initiative and every piece, because you have your scorecard. You have your governance framework for how you're going to judge whether or not the district is moving in the right direction. And that's where we're at. The last example I'll give about the power of metrics and data. So Starbucks is real busy these days, right? Nobody goes through a drive-through now at Starbucks and doesn't see a long line, right? So the Starbucks by my house on Rand Road over by Elmhurst there, I noticed, now this is going back a little bit, but I noticed that, because this line goes all the way around the corner, right? But I noticed that in there, and I don't know if this was deliberate or they just had the monitor the wrong way, but as I pulled up, right, to get my Starbucks, they had a little dashboard up there, and all the cars were there, and it had a actual number of minutes that each car was waiting. And my car, I saw was like 7 minutes and 28 seconds, and I wanted my latte, and I was like over 7 minutes, and my car was red, right? But I could see it. But that sent a very powerful message to me, right? Because as a patron, I was looking at that saying, yeah, that's 7 minutes and 28 seconds is very unacceptable. But you know what? Starbucks knows about it. They don't think it's good either because my car is red, right? So there were some other ones that are green. Just I say that just as a little anecdote of how powerful reporting of very key performance indicators is. Because just the fact that I could see that, just the fact that I knew that Starbucks knew that I waited over 7 minutes for my latte, and that they judged that as unacceptable, that made me feel good. They're working on it, right? And so, just another, little story of, the power of committing to metrics, communicating metrics, and ultimately governing the organization through those metrics. And so that's the end goal. We're going to assume nothing. We're going to start from the beginning, and we may not even get to anything granular today in terms of a metric. We may just get to broad definitions of things, which is fine. All right. We'll come back at another time and get more granular. So I'm happy to take questions as we go too, if anybody has burning questions before we actually start facilitation.
I feel like I should have some kind of a metric for our company, but I can't give you one right now that would be somewhat humorous, so I'll just move on. I know I got one in there someplace. It'll come up later, I'm sure. I think John's comments about the direction of the organization is really critical. I think it's really important to frame a little bit where we're at. I'm going to come back to you in a minute and ask your thoughts on this, so be thinking about this. What do you want to get out of tonight as board members particularly, because the staff's here to work with you. So I'm going to come back to board members and say, what are you hoping to clarify? What would you like to talk more about? What do you want to get to tonight so we don't miss that part of the conversation? But this is going to be an evening where we want to hear from board members so that information can be plowed into the work as it goes forward. And I think we can't get that unless you're talking to us. We can go very fast if we just present, but then we walk away and then it's not yours and it's not very complete or robust. I think that being a board member today, sometimes we get these projects at a very exhausting time. I mean, you guys must be really wore out. I mean, I can't think of a time over the history of schools that boards and administration people I've talked to are just completely exhausted. And I think that it's important to say that because the quality of work that you're trying to do, in spite of all that, you're committed for that, I think, as an organization, as a community. Elmhurst is one of those outstanding communities, a great place to live. It's something that everybody talks about away from your community. If you're in other areas, it's well known throughout the state. It's a place that people like to be in and would want their kids to be in school here. It's a really high-performing place. Sometimes we get into projects and start taking a look at ourselves. We tend to be like our kids sometimes, right? Our kids are never good enough to us. And then neighbors say, boy, your son, your daughter did a really great thing for us. And we don't even know those things go on. Schools are a little bit like that. We can be really critical internally in the hopes of trying to get better. But out there in the real world, in the big world beyond 205, there's just so many positive things that come back around your school district. I think that's really important. I think that the other thing that's, I guess I'd put in a bucket of marketing about who you are, and what's your brand as a board. I mean, as you work together, you're a fairly new board, I would say. In fact, you've had an election that was not so long ago, and in half of that time, you've been caught up in crisis management for the most part, probably. So, but what is your brand become as a board? You got elected on probably certain positions as you thought about wanting to run for the board, and you let people know what your biography was and what you thought was important to you. Maybe you campaigned on some things that were important, but now you're not that. You get to talk individually at a board meeting, but now you're a board. And if I could leave you with anything tonight at all that's most important is that brand as a board. Because interesting to me, the work I've done with boards, sometimes they've had some fussing and some controversies, and I've probably been a part of some of those over the years. But when you go out and start talking, they don't usually talk about a Jim or a Beth or a Courtney. Might talk a lot about Dave, just that kind of where it falls. But it's the board. And you've heard that, the board. Well, who is this board? Not who are they individually, but what do you stand for and what are you working on as a collection of people responsible for the school district? I think it's critically important. And your brand is really driven by your actions. So when you vote, when you speak, when you have messages and objectives and goals, that becomes who you are. When you discuss certain important topics, and you know, this is nothing new. This is something you've heard probably 100 times. But I really think it's important to realize you're establishing a brand. Whether you want it or not, it's going to happen. And so I really think this idea of, and I say it as a backdrop to vision, that we're going to get to in a few minutes, is important because that's a place to start. You know, what you think about, what's important to you, what you communicate, that really becomes part of that brand that I think is so important. I think the coming together is important. There's a lot of things that you've done probably already to do that, so I don't want to talk about, but I think it's important. The second thing I'll leave you with about the board and the brand is that I always view boards, and this is a clunky word probably, I think it's a downstate word where I grew up, lubrication, meaning that what the board does either causes things to go forward or they tend to stop things. And meaning that you have the power to say, where are we going and what are we going to be doing? And are we going? Are we going to, I know it doesn't happen here, are we going to debate these things until the cows come home? And then what happens in that situation is that the organization behind you stops. And so how much are you accelerating the growth and helping the organization move forward as the board? And I think it's just important to realize you have tremendous authority and a tremendous amount of power that's going to influence all of that. And so I just wanted to get that on the table tonight. Before we go any further, can we hear from maybe board members about what you hope to get out of tonight and the session we're doing and what's important to you about tonight, so that we don't miss that and we want to bring that back potentially to as we go through a conversation? Go ahead, Martha, sure.
So I know this sounds really basic, but what I'm looking to get out of is to have defined measurements on what it means to be college, career, and life ready. And one of the things that I think is interesting perspective is that those are not separate buckets, that they are the same bucket. So how do we put all of those pieces together and make sure we're ensuring our students are capable and competent in all three of those areas?
Tremendous insight. Other board members who would like to talk or be called on? Class, anyone? Go ahead.
Thanks, sorry, here we go. Typically, metrics are academics. And ultimately, that's what you're measured on in the nation. And I also would like to know, how do you, in an education environment, how do you also measure the soft skills, which are the harder skills, around the whole child. Because the more that you do that, the academics will go up. Because what we're trying to do is create that global engaged citizenship that's respectful and professional, and we want that as adults in the system, starting at the top with the board, all the way through to our students, and so that we can have dialogue about anything and respect each other in that dialogue. So I think that that's really, I mean, we've done a lot of things, but what I'd like to see is help us connect the dots, that we can show the results of the good things that we've been doing over the last decade in addressing culture, which I would say is kind of that whole adult or whole child or whole person, and then the outcomes. And I know that we're here really about the student, the academics, but at some point, John, you talked about it, and I know that when I got on the board almost 10 years ago, we talked about we have to really start measuring the whole organization and every department, because then that helps that all the employees understand what we're trying to achieve, and that it's not just the board or the community beating up everyone in the district, but we're all in it together, understanding, what we believe in, what our values are, and, how we're going to go about doing what we're going to do. That's a lot, but that's kind of where my head is right now. And then we'll hone in, I know.
Well, and certainly those soft things that are important in relationships, the social emotional components of our kids. How do we take care of our kids? And I think that it's really critical that, and I think we all are a little bit adverse to numbers and metrics. John's an aberration, maybe. He's kind of a pain because of that we're the numbers and the metrics. We go to the office, we got numbers and metrics, metrics and numbers. It's just phenomenal at sorting out what they should be. But a lot of us are thinking about those relationships kids need, the development they need, their well-being. Are they helping other kids be okay? And I've always believed with the kids and my grandkids, they know what's happening in the school system, and how do we get that from them? What are the voices of the kids telling us? And again, that may not be a metric per se. I think some of that can be in a metric form and survey forms and how they're feeling, but some of that is what processes do we use as we go about collecting data and as we go about changing the culture, which I think is a really critical word. That gets a lot of attention, but sometimes the actions are really hard because of all the things we're doing. But great insight. Other board members' thoughts, those have been well stated. It doesn't have to be, and you don't have to speak as long. It can be a couple of words. It can be whatever you want to say. So just looking for how do we want to clarify tonight that's going to be helpful in your mind.
I'll go.
Okay, sure.
So I have up here our current key indicators, and sort of to Karen's point, not to take away what our current indicators are, but in thinking about those kids that are going to be career ready right after York, are we doing enough to make sure along the way that they're having that opportunity when their senior year comes and they're ready to walk across that stage, hopefully, and out the door? So because I feel like we don't, and I don't know what those indicators are and how you judge that and how you make sure we're on track for that segment of our population.
Right.
But I don't want them to find out come senior year, there's stuff they should have done and they're not doing. So how do we keep track of that metric to make sure that they're ready for their career choice after York?
Super, a lot of work on that area, so great thought. Others? Jim, go ahead.
I guess I'm in John's camp. If you can measure it, you can improve it. So I'm curious, we send 93 or 95% of our kids on to college. So I'm curious and we are an academic institution. Our community views us as that as our primary mission. So I'm curious what the highest performing school districts that you've ever met use as their metrics and how we perform in comparison?
We certainly have data from across the country and in Illinois that can help you look at that as we go forward. And again, I think you look at the whole child, you look at where they're headed, and you want to be academically challenging, but in a safe environment. But how well are other schools doing? And that comparison thing comes up a lot as you do strategic plans, and you have neighbors and people that you think are high performing, and how do you do compared to that? So I think it's something we can get to and help focus on that and how you answer that question.
One thing I would add to that too is you brought up a really important point. Once we get to the piece of actually defining the metrics, defining the KPIs, then a whole conversation related to that has to start around benchmarks. Because you can't just report a number on its own. It has no meaning on its own, right? And so numbers only have meaning when they're situated against other numbers that also have meaning. And so
To your analogy, I'm sure every airline CEO can tell you what not only his on-time arrival rate, but every single one of its competitors.
absolutely. So part of the conversation that we will have when we get to that point is, so tonight, if I could, I'll kind of summarize, I think, what I've heard here. I think, oh, go ahead. Yeah, let's go, and then I'll try to summarize kind of what I.
Sure. I'm just excited that we're having this conversation so that I do think it's important to all be on the same page and be working towards the same goals. And I just want to make sure that the metrics that we have cover all of our students. And sometimes we're looking at a certain population or a certain academic group. I just like to make sure that we have metrics that can help us to ensure the success of all students in any range. And that our metrics are useful, that we can take that information and then, know what we're going to do with that in order to have a plan to move forward. So, thank you.
So I guess, everybody said a lot of great things. I think what I would like to see us get to is a real point of clarity where every person in the organization, every parent that puts their kid in school knows exactly what the vision and priorities of the district are. And that when I as a board member, we as a board, make a decision in the boardroom, we understand, what metric that's going to, I guess, help or, grow, and kind of that boardroom to classroom. So, why this decision and how does that improve or grow, what's happening in the classroom. And so I guess for me, it's a lot about clarity. Like we have a lot of data points and, we can even ask for a lot of data, but if you don't, like you said, connect the data to something, it's just data. And so I would just like clarity, I guess, on where I know we say college, career, and life ready, but, what does that mean if you have a second grader or, so.
Anyone from the administrative staff want to jump in here after those really insightful comments? Oh, sure.
Just one, accountability. I think that by having a clear definition of what we want to measure, it helps everyone in the organization be accountable to what we're trying to do. That was a couple words, but.
Important words. John, you were going to?
Yeah, I think in taking all this in, a few things sort of came to mind that I think can help add some structure to the conversation tonight, and then we'll dive right in. So Margaret, you mentioned that your comments, the way that I interpreted those comments, is you recognize that college, career, and life readiness is one vision. It's not three separate visions. I think that's really important. So I think when we talk tonight about how do we define college, career, and life readiness, I think just as a way to structure this dialogue tonight, I think recognizing that college, career, and life readiness is one construct, not three constructs, is very important. So I think that that's, that's one important piece. Karen, you had mentioned about this idea about, we know that we're here talking about academics, but we have to talk about some of the other stuff eventually too. So the purpose of tonight, though, is we're talking about student success. So it's broader than just what you may think of as just pure sort of academic outcomes, right? If it falls within the category of a student level outcome, and the way that I'm defining student level outcome, meaning it's something measurable at the student level, right? That's part of the conversation tonight around student success, because it's a set of outcomes or indicators that could be traced back to an individual student. That's sort of the way you should think about what's within scope and what's out of scope tonight. Is this something measurable or collectible or observable at the individual student level, right? Then in subsequent sessions, we can talk about how do you organize the other system level pieces. And so you'll see a lot of different examples of this, and we can bring some in other sessions too, about how you organize sort of the totality of the, I would say usually it's 3 to 5 areas. Usually there's always some version of student success, and that is the conversation today. Then there's some version of the learning environment, right? Sometimes districts break out community relations as part of that. Sometimes they just call it learning environment. Sometimes they call it culture climate, but it has to do with sort of the soft part of the organization, right? But outcomes that don't track back to individual students, outcomes that are system related. And then they have some version of finance and operations, which is the HR and the facilities and the finances and all of those. So the reason I say that is just to give you a broader sense of ultimately where we're going, starting with student success. But I think tonight, if we come away from here tonight with a way to organize your thoughts around what comprises the area of student success with a vision of college and career ready, with some broad strokes of the areas that you think these metrics should address, I think that that's a job well done. So you could think about, there's lots of different ways districts do this, but as you think about student success, so what do I mean by these areas, right? You could talk about academic proficiency, you could talk about academic growth, you could talk about social emotional competencies, right? You could talk about engagement, you could talk about participation, you can talk about citizenship, you can talk about, these are all areas that emerge usually out of a process like this. But if we can come to some consensus by the end of the day that college, career, and life readiness, that vision at the student level means this, that, and come up with, however many, not too many, maybe, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe areas, right, that collectively represent that vision, and then begin to define what those areas are. I think we've taken, a real step towards identifying what the actual metrics will be. So,
Clarifications on that, on John's comment?
I just add one thing, and I want to make sure this is kind of integrating Jim and Courtney's point as a clarification. Yes, the majority, a large percent of our students go on to some type of formal college. But in my mind, when I think of college, career, and life ready, I'm not just talking about a formal college setting. What I'm thinking of is some type of advanced high school education or learning, and everybody does that. Everybody does that, whether they go to trade school, whether they go to the military, whether they go to a job. Everybody has some type of additional secondary learning that they have to be ready and prepared for. So that's what college is, perhaps too narrow of a word to use right now, but it's a placeholder for us to say, this advanced learning that people have to have.
And to your point, Margaret, if they're ready for any of those things, then they're not stuck if they've decided that a decision that they thought they had made in high school was not exactly what they decided they wanted to do. So then they would be ready to shift gears and do something else. So I agree with that.
Other observations from the comments that have been made? Yeah, I think that is an important one too, about putting this in one bucket. When I grew up, I wanted to be a teacher, and grew up in a family of construction people, and so I always knew I was going to do that. I wanted to do that, but my granddaughter, U of I, has got 3 majors because she's just not sure where things are going to end up. And I think kids that are not going to traditional college, for example, are going to be in the same position of not knowing or shifting sand. How many things did we do a year ago, 8 months ago, that we're not doing today? And how are you preparing kids for then that changing world that they're going to grow up in, and changing rapidly, as someone said earlier, how quickly things can change. And so the idea that all kids are going to be highly successful and highly prepared, and the pathways that you create may cause them to go different ways to get there, but there is if you go through the Elmhurst 205 schools, you're going to be highly prepared to be successful. And depending on what pathway you take, then you may end up with a certificate, a license. In addition to that, you may end up with a number of college credits in it for that. You may end up walking into a school setting with other preparations for that, but you're going to be successful. And how do we do that? One of the things just before we move on though, and because John said it, Margaret was saying it a little bit, and we kind of clarified, do we have agreement that we're talking about one bucket, that the college career life readiness, we're talking about a construct of what we're trying to do, that's one highly success vision that we have for student success? Or are we still, or are there some of you thinking that this should be broken down into 1, 2, or 3 different domains, and each of those has its own? Pardon?
Sounds
Okay,
pretty
all right.
good.
Terrific.
Yeah, because I think no matter whether you're college or trade or career, as long as you are prepared for that next step, that's success.
Right.
So that's, in my mind, that's one bucket.
And that's very consistent with the national conversation on this topic.
When you look at the vision, and we move on a little bit, when you look at the vision, and as it starts rolling out to what Kara was saying, where it's across the departments and out there, how do you, as board members, see the impact of a vision? I mean, you've had a vision for a while. It's been in your documents. It's on the front of a lot of things you put out there. Where do you see it going in the organization? Maybe where it hasn't gone, or where do you see it going that's been effectively communicated and acted on? Where do you, I mean, let me paint a different picture for a second. So often, strategic plans and vision documents and goals and objectives end up on a shelf somewhere, and something else is driving the work of a district. And that, again, not here, not near you, certainly not neighbors of yours, didn't do it that way, but there are places where it's hard to see what those things are, and so it's obvious to some extent those things aren't driving particular districts. And everything you've said so far tonight is about making this come alive and to be something that you're very connected to, and the organization is very connected to. If it's connected, where does it connect to? What parts of the organization are you seeing it connected to?
I think, oh, go ahead.
Some have been said already.
I was just gonna say, I feel like there's a lot of focus on the college piece, so I think, that is big and people get that. But I'm not sure about the rest of the pieces, and I feel like we don't really, I don't know if talking about, I'm not sure that the life ready piece, you know, I'm not sure if I know like what Margaret thinks life ready looks like, or Beth, or, and even what, you know, a teacher in the classroom might say if they were asked what life ready looks like. So I feel like in order for the vision to really move forward, you have to really, I mean, it sounds so, but everybody has to be able to articulate what that means. Like, are we trying to get every kid ready for college? That might be what the perception is, and maybe we are, you know, but, or is it, you know, just what are we trying to do? So I would say, I think everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, but I think a majority of the organization understands that's what we want, but I don't think that if they were asked one-on-one to define it, that there would be a lot of similarity,
And
continuity.
and hopefully that's what you get out of this process. I mean, that's what we're here to do. And I think it's a good segue into sort of the first posing, you know, question or facilitation as it relates to this of, like, how do you compartmentalize? What are the major buckets that comprise college, career, and life readiness? I think that's a good place to start. So how do you think about that? Do you think about that there's an academic piece, there's a proficiency piece, there's a growth piece, there's an SEL piece, there's a citizenship piece? What are the pieces, I think, is, you know, forget about what the metrics are, how you observe it, how you measure it, any of that, but starting the conversation of what are those components, right, that collectively represent college, career, life readiness. I think that's the first piece in helping people have a common understanding of how we define this. Because if you can ultimately end up with some kind of graphic, you know, people call it portrait of a graduate, they call it vision for student success, however you do, but that college, career, and life readiness means this, and this as measured through this, and this. And then it's real clear. So that's, I would maybe kind of pose that to the group as the first maybe thing to start thinking about of how do you identify the major areas that define college, career, and life readiness.
Can I jump in? Is
Yes,
that
please.
possible? So when I think about these sorts of things, like my parents are always asking me, yeah, but are you happy? You know, is that where you are? And so I think when we think about college, career, and life ready, that life readiness piece, we should be, like, our ultimate goal should be to prepare our students to be able to adapt and be malleable, and to adapt to a situation that they are unfamiliar with, and that is new and challenging, all of those other sorts of things. And that takes a lot of different skills that are going to underlie that. So how we unwrap that in the district is really important.
I think I agree with that. The adaptability piece, I think, is huge, Kevin. And I think that students being able to advocate for themselves and building those relationship pieces where they would be able to find what they need, seek out the help that they need if they have to move in a different direction, be able to advocate for themselves and have the skills to figure out how to do that.
One of the other pieces, well, actually, there's two things that I wrote down, and the one thing, and I like Kevin, your definition of adaptable better, because I was thinking, initially I wrote down coachable, a little bit of a sports background, but I wrote down coachable, but that's in a career. If you can't accept feedback, if you can't take that feedback and make yourself better or make the situation better, then you don't advance in your career. Adaptable is a much better term, but that's where my mind was going. The other piece that I heard mentioned was citizenship. And I think that's the important part because, well, it's important that we can self-advocate for ourselves, that we are adaptable. Part of being adaptable is being able to look at the situation, the scenario that you are in, and understand how to make it better, how to make your situation, the scenario, the community that you are in better. Now, as soon as I say that community, I immediately get to the idea that with all the technology that we have, the world has gotten a lot smaller. So we don't have the same community that they had in the 20s or even before. Our community is our global community. So how do we operate? How do we make sure our children know how to operate in a global community?
I may be getting ahead of the whole process here, but just a couple of times this has been said. We talk about career ready. So kid K through 12 in our district, keep your eye on your own paper. Put that phone away. Don't ask your neighbor for help. You get in a job, the team succeeds, the organization succeeds. Help one another. If you don't know how to do it, ask for help. Use your resources. Exactly the opposite of what it takes to succeed in the real world is what we're pounded into these kids for 12 years.
I think just kind of, I mean, yes. And I think, you know, now with technology, and of course right now, technology is changing education, changing everything. But, you know, content, while you need foundational content, you know, it is all about how teaching, you know, how do you make sure that kids can think critically? Can they look at something that they read online and make a critical assessment of, you know, is that true, or how do I figure out if it's true? You know, how do I effectively research, and then how do I, you know, communicate? I just feel like all those, you know, it goes back to some of the soft skills, but it's really to me about skills. And I realize there's also a content piece because you need a foundational content, but how do we measure that the kids are getting those skills? I know we talk about like the 6 C's, and which I guess would kind of be that, but I just feel like the content is important, and there is a component of content, but then how do you help the kids really leave here, you know, problem solvers and thinkers, and critically assess and communicate, and because those are the skills that, you know, will to me help you be college, career, and life ready.
Are there other thoughts from the team and from the board members that are here? Those are insightful, certainly.
So taking that a step further, then how do you think about the sort of the major categories of how that might be organized?
So John, are you asking, like, are you trying to get us to talk about how are we defining college, career, and life ready?
Correct.
And what those metrics might be? And so I would say academics and individual students, as you said. I really like the way that you approach it with student level outcomes. But how do we connect the dots to the national level? So our metrics with the national metrics, because that's true benchmarking. So I would say academics. I would say growth. because what you want to do is everyone wants to grow, and that's how they have the inner sense of confidence and to move to the next level, and whether it be change or coaching or adaptability or whatever it happens to be, or be open to somebody else, right? A new idea. And then you talked about proficiencies. I'm thinking two different perspectives with that, and so I don't know what your expertise is. Because one is that whole child, but two, proficiencies is like what we do in this district with standards, and you have to be proficient in XYZ standards for reading, grade 1, grade 2, you know, that sort of thing. So I wanted to get a sense of what you meant by proficiencies, because then it also could be what I keep calling them soft skills, even though they're the harder ones to do, but the social emotional, and you know, we're doing all those sorts of things. So how do we really measure all the things that we're doing, right? Because I really do believe that we put in a lot of things in this district since we came up with that college, career, and life ready, I don't know, within the last decade. And to Steve's point, was it something on the shelf? No, and we actually talked about it back then. And I could name a bunch of things that we're doing that actually help with the soft skills, that help with that help with the whole child, that help with academics. So I think that we're doing the right things, but how do we know in the process that we're doing it, that it's successful and that it's leading to that outcome of each individual student, you know, growing or getting to a certain level, right, that they want to, or that we as a district, like we are, should get people to. And then, well, the second piece. Oh, and then how do we compare at a national level? Because that's what people look at to, you know, do they want to move here or not? Or our students will get into X colleges or X career based on the district's reputation. So that's kind, you know, I kind of did a little bit, and then the connecting the dots.
No, but your framework is exactly what we're here to do tonight. So what are the indicators that collectively represent whether all the actions that are happening within the district produce the desired outcome? So we're not here to talk about stuff you're doing. We're here to talk about the impact that all of that is having. And so so we really do have to separate out the strategic goals and objectives that sort of represent the actions of the district, things that we're going to do so that if we're doing it well and we've chosen wisely and are strategic and we well executed these initiatives, it should have a positive impact on these metrics. So that's what it means to create the KPIs. So, but I think that the first thing is we have to get those major buckets, right, of what those are, and then we can go underneath them and start talking about exactly what those measurements are. But you did bring up a really important piece that people can start thinking about, and we can talk about it today in sort of general terms of, I mean, you came back to this idea of a benchmark, which is really, really important. Of once we have a metric and we have a number, what is the most meaningful comparison to draw or to situate that number against? That is not an easy, it's easy to just say the nation, okay? But there's a lot of nuance in that, right? And I can give you some context and research and things that go into, you know, in general, our experience and research from Gallup poll and things would support this as well is, you know, if you add, this is just general kind of sentiment research, right, that Gallup does a lot of. If you just randomly ask somebody in your community, right, what's the state of public education in the nation? You're going to get a very unfavorable kind of result. It's like 19% favorable. If you ask that same exact person, right, how favorable are you to your school or your school district? You're going to get a very favorable, in general, you're going to get a very favorable response, closer to 70%. So there's a massive gap between when you ask somebody generally, how's the nation doing, and then when you ask them how their school district's doing, right? And so there's this big perception gap. And so what that motivates is sort of to keep the conversation local. And in our experience, now there is a need for national benchmarking. I'm not saying that there isn't. But I would venture to say that most of your community members walking around are not asking the question, how does District 205 compare to the nation? They're asking a more local question. They're
Well,
saying-
they are looking at U.S. News and World Report, Niche, all of those. That's what I mean by national.
Yeah, if you're looking at the top rankings and those kinds of things, which are important, but they're also asking, so how do I compare to some other, especially in higher performing districts, they want a benchmark that's higher than the nation. Like if you're talking like U.S. News and World Report, that's like are we top 10 in the nation? So that's a very rigorous benchmark, right? So that makes sense. But in higher performing systems, our experience is that they're after some benchmark that might even be a little bit more nuanced than the nation. But that's a conversation. There's no wrong or right with this. It's whatever you believe is the right way to look at it.
It only makes sense to compare yourself against best in class.
And that's kind of what I was getting at. It depends on, but that's the fundamental piece of how do you encapsulate the values of the community into this process. The choice of benchmarks and comparisons is a very specific way that you do that.
Yeah. And so when I think about in that comment about you always compare yourself with the best in class, and yes, so I think we always want to be number one. But in our striving to get to number one, what do we need to do to get there? And so maybe what we need to do to get there is, maybe that's what this conversation is. What do we need to do to get there? What are the things that we can put in place now? What are those buckets that we keep referring back to? And I think one of the easy ones is the academic bucket. And I don't mean easy to achieve, I just mean easy to identify. So I think that's an easy one. Another one, and we can, this is,
How are we feeling about that one? Is that one we can take to the bank?
Is that an obvious one that College Grade United States? Yeah, okay.
All right, well, just
So before we even go farther than that, by academics, let's talk a little bit deeper as it relates to academics. So what do we mean by academics?
Are you asking a question, John?
Yeah, I'm asking a question like,
Well, I know, but I mean, are you thinking about organizationally or individually?
I'm thinking about, does academics mean grade level proficiency standards? Does it mean academic growth on reading and math? Does it mean participation in AP classes? What does it mean? What are the major, like, what does academics mean? So to get the conversation kind of started, is it proficiency, is it growth? Do you just mean the core subject areas? Do you mean something wider than that?
I would suggest that it is about growth and it is about proficiency. It's about the important standardized tests in Illinois that have chosen the SAT, and the growth between the PSAT and the SAT, I would think is an important growth measure. I mean, is this the kind of stuff
Yes,
you're looking for?
yeah.
I would think reading proficiency in the early grades is an important standard to make sure we're on track. Expected growth in our elementary testing suite. I believe our provider gives us what they think expected growth is. Frankly, I don't know how reliable or how much we should rely on that. I think you also have to look at, when it comes to high school, since so many of our kids go to college, how many of our kids actually get a post-secondary class experience before they leave high school? Because they're going to be taking a bunch of them the next year. And do they know what college rigor is all about? And have they had at least one opportunity to experience that?
I mean, these are all the indicators we have in place right now. I mean, we're talking about exactly what we already have. I'm looking at it and it's, advanced placement participation and passing rate, students taking an AP class, seniors with at least one post-secondary experience. These are all the things we already have in place.
you don't think they're important, then.
No, I'm not saying, I guess, I'm not saying they're not important. I'm saying, what else is there? I mean, I know these. I'm saying, I guess that's what I'm looking to kind of learn tonight, is what are we missing?
Yeah,
Because
I'm
we're,
kind of spewing out what I know, so. I
When we're
agree,
starting
that's
with
a
the
great
easy
question.
stuff, and hopefully, we'll, as you start thinking about, you'll identify some of the, but again, this is a value to, there's no right or wrong answer here. This is what the community values. That's what your job is here to do,
We're not trying to throw those out. We're saying if those are there and relevant going forward, as you revise work that's going to happen. One of the things that I wanted to get at a little bit earlier about the vision was the alignment of the system is driven by that vision, meaning that what you decide about these standards goes everywhere. Second grade, first grade, preschool, special needs kids, college prep, career kids thinking about licensing for certification and career, wherever. It also goes to accountability that Kara mentioned earlier. It goes to communication to the public, et cetera, et cetera. So what you develop should be going everywhere, and it does define what you're working on. The things you've been doing be perfectly fine, but you may want to adjust some of those or refine some of those. If you think about comparisons down the road, how you do that, because everyone has a number for how many kids go to college. I'm not sure we'd all agree on what that number represents. In Illinois, they've tried to define it over the years to make sure we all use the same metrics. But if you do that across the country, is that metric the same from place to place to place? Or how many kids are successful in AP courses gets played with as well. And so as you look at data, is it valid and reliable data? Can you compare and not be using the wrong metrics as we get to that in maybe phase 2 of our work with you?
And that's where the conversation of benchmarks is important, because if you look at national, even in Illinois here too, in national, if you were to go by the percentage of students that met grade level proficiency standards as defined by state level tests, whether in Illinois or other states, you're going to come up with a number roughly 45 to 50% in terms of students meeting like college and career readiness standards as published by states, right, where they drew that line in the sand. But if you actually track those students as they go out to college, you'll find that about 70% of students are actually going to college and being successful. So there's this is the conversation of benchmarking, right? You can't equate policy lines in the sand for accountability that necessarily represents what you're after as a board to mean what it actually means to be ready for college. So I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We'll talk deeper in that in terms of this is the nuance of the metrics. And coming back to the conversation over here, just like you may have started identifying the things that you already had, have you taken the next step of challenging yourself to say, okay, what about the nuance of what we're actually counting here? Or like, are we counting? There's like AP participation, there's a lot of different ways that nationally you'll see that metric crafted. So now I think it's a matter of just getting the big buckets, and so I think that's important. Are there things related to proficiency and growth that are outside the test score piece of it?
That's what I would like to hear more about. I'm sure there's a lot that we're doing in that area, but I'm just not exactly sure. I know some of the grade levels at which we're measuring growth in certain areas, but along the way, how we are measuring growth, I think, is important. It's just like if you're not measuring how kids are doing until the final, then you've maybe missed an opportunity along the way to change course. So I would just like to know in our district how we are measuring that along the way and using that feedback or using the data.
Something I would like to see is how do you measure communication? Meaning, like we talk about a reading level and, you math, but how do you really, writing now, you think of how much of our lives is email and creating writing pieces. How do you measure that maybe along the way? Like what measure, I know like it's being done in classrooms, but I guess maybe from our standpoint, whether it's a benchmark or a, what tells us that, our kids are prepared. You talk about how they're prepared math-wise and reading, but then how do you measure that in writing? And I know maybe that gets down too deep into the nuances, but I don't know. I feel like that's part of the, it's also part of the skills we're talking about, a little bit of communication. And so how does that get measured? And maybe speaking is part of that too. I don't know, but.
As I looked at our metrics, I noticed, and it's easy from this standpoint, from 8th grade through 12, you've got that nice little PSAT, the growth. And I know that when we had the NWEA, the MAP test, that fed into it, but now there's the IRA. I mean, there's so many, the state is changing so many different things. It's like, how do we ever get a stake in the ground and show growth and the connection points? Then I know that we also have the age or grade 3 reading level, but we don't have anything for EC, which is really important, right? Because if you can get some key development at the early childhood level, that will get a lot of your achievement gap students higher. So what metrics would help there? We implemented all-day kindergarten. So how do we measure before and after that half day, full day? I'm wondering, is it valuable? How does that feed into this? And I guess I keep asking kind of questions to you all because this is your field, trying to get some guidance here. And then what was the other piece that I was thinking about? EC, kindergarten, and the immersion program for a language and for, the students with ELL. Those are, key programs that we invested a lot in. And therefore, how is that impacting our students? Because that's why we make the decisions, is, to provide what our students and our community, what our students need, what would help them be the student success.
So Karen, there's, there's a couple things I just want to say that are interesting. One is, you're talking a little bit about measuring programs. So measuring programs and measuring the students might be slightly different depending on what you're trying to find out. But I do understand that's why we're trying to get into this program analysis concept of wanting to know what impact these different things that the board is supporting has. So I get that. But I do want to point out that just because we don't have current specific KPIs related to early childhood, they have some very defined measures that they use that lead into kindergarten readiness that are completely mirror identically what the state standards are for early childhood. So some of the things that you're talking about may be measured and may be used internally, but may not be reported from a KPI perspective all the time. So I just thought I would mention that.
So one of the things I mentioned, academics, that's what we have, that's what we know. And I don't mean to say it's easy, or I don't mean to suggest that it is not something that we have to continue to work to improve at. But one of the things that, Karen, you brought up that made me think about this, it was these achievement gaps. What do they mean? And perhaps what they mean, and not in all cases, perhaps what they mean is at some point in time, the student has checked out. And how do we keep that student engaged? How do we keep all our students engaged? And I think those are the pieces of what kind of skills, what does that look like? What are those types of skills to keep all our students engaged?
and I guess I would add to that is, what was it that made them not engage? Because, that's the whole neuroscience, psychology that we're learning about from child development that is impactful, and that's those, the softer stuff around academics or around someone's success. And so it's, what is it that we are doing that the student's not going to necessarily know? But, how do we figure
Well,
that
the question I
out?
would say is, how do you know if a student's not engaged? So that's what I'd pose. So what could you observe? What would you be,
Attendance rates? Discipline problems?
so this is good, this is what I'm good at.
Yeah. Missing a
But we were doing the engagement thing. There's how the workshop model and that sort of thing, that you're measuring engagement, student engagement. And so maybe there's some metric that, or indicator that we can get from.
So how, any other ideas? How would you know if a student's not engaged?
I don't know if this, oh, sorry, Margaret, were you saying? Oh. Does extracurriculars, is that, I know it's not like the academic piece, and yet it's engagement in the school community. So participation in extracurricular, I guess, is that, what would that,
I mean, that's something that districts track pretty closely, under different kinds of labels, but that's definitely something they track.
There's 5 essentials data we could use for student engagement. The 5 essentials data, we could use that to ask questions regarding student engagement to the students.
You don't get reporting back on that at the kid level, though, do you?
Depends on the grade.
Right. So that would be really useful data maybe when we
Actually-
get to the learning environment, like a,
And it's broken up by subgroups now.
We get subgroup level data. In other words, we don't get individual student data, but for example, we know these are the ways that students who have IEPs responded and the kids who don't.
which is awesome data, like when we start talking about like that, I'm just, as a generic header, like the sort of that learning environment bucket that's more system oriented. Trying to keep the conversation tonight as what's observable at the kid level. Like what can you actually observe at the student level? That's how we're defining this, or at least drawing a box around student success as something that's observable at the student level, and then we'll work in those other pieces.
For students with disabilities, I think that we should be looking at the percentage of the day in general education and how that compares with others. And just as an example that, nationally about 70% of, the benchmark is supposed to be about 80% of the day is spent in general education environment. And so how do we compare to that? And are we aiming for that? And are our courses set up for that at each of our grade levels to make sure that we have appropriate supports put into place at every grade level?
So how would you say the percent of time spent in?
General education. And then similarly, for our transition students, the percentage of students who are employed with appropriate transition skills and that they have actually competitive employment is what we're looking for in our transition programs. So, and that involves the entire community and making sure that it's not a 4-year graduation rate, it's actually a 6-year graduation rate.
Okay.
One other thought that I had about maybe how you can tell whether they're engaged is their level of communication with their teacher and or their peers. You know, those that are engaged are maybe more communicative and saying what they need or don't need, and those that aren't may not.
So participation maybe as part of that. I know a lot of teachers measure class participation.
So far, just based on what's come out in my notes, so far, we kind of have working categories here of academics. There's a proficiency piece of that, there's a growth piece of that, at the secondary level, there's this post-secondary experience piece. There's an early childhood piece related to that as well. We have so we have sort of academics, we have communication as something separate from academics potentially that deals with written and speaking and collaboration, and just working kind of my notes that I took. Then we have a engagement bucket. There were some things like attendance and discipline and missing work and participation in co-curricular activities and communication with teachers and peers and class participation. Again, we're not making any decisions here, but just kind of trying to form some of these buckets. And then we have this thing of special need populations. There's that, and looking at that in terms of how that's being spent in terms of percent of time in general education, transition programming, graduation, 6-year graduation rates, those kinds of ideas. What other, if I were just to say to you, college career and life readiness means academics, communication, engagement, and addressing special needs. So what's missing? Or what's wrong? Or what's...
I don't hear any of the how you work with each other, how you understand, attempt to learn from each other. I don't hear any of those pieces yet. Right now, to me, it seems more self-focused, and I'm thinking how you look out into the world.
So that's similar to, I just want to point out, just so we don't miss it, I think that concept is similar to something that Jim brought up before, right? Would you say that, Jim? Yeah.
Six C's, Margaret? I mean, those are, can you list? They're right there. Oh, there we are. Creativity, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, citizenship, and character. All right.
And so maybe I'm looking for the citizenship one, where, and I'm putting that citizenship and character maybe together, but that's what I'm trying to find more on.
And so is that measured by, like, I know that at least at York, there's a boatload of opportunities for our students to be involved in clubs and activities with the community and to demonstrate those characters. Is that how we measure something like that? Participation in that way?
So there's a lot of ways that districts have tried to get at some of this, this stuff. Citizenship piece can go directions of community service hours and other kinds of project-based learning, participation in these things. So like that's how I've seen that, that play out. Logging community service hours, engaging in service learning projects, establishing some kind of community pathway or with experiences. That's how I've seen that nationally. Those kinds of metrics, citizenship usually has to do with participation or logging of some kinds of hours or service learning projects.
I think the disengagement piece has been talked a little bit about, though, is as you look at students that struggle to stay engaged in schools at younger grades, for example, there becomes, in my mind at least, sort of an isolation of kids. Not that you do that here, nobody does it on purpose, but kids start pulling back at some point. They, for lots of reasons that all of you have probably heard about, studied, or read about and talked about in your lives. But it seems like that pulling back, and then how do you get your hands around who are those? What are some indicators of that when kids start pulling away? And I think it happens at a very young age before they start tuning out and tuning out and tuning out. And nationally, sadly, we see kids raising kids. What percentage of that happens probably goes up as you look at the poverty levels in communities, which isn't something you're looking at necessarily. But kids are, some people would say kids are largely abandoned as they grow up. And so it impacts the school, certainly. So how do if we look at disengagement and kids not being engaged and connecting, what tells us that's happening to some of the kids? I'm not sure, depending on what data you collect, is citizenship going to do that? I mean, sometimes numbers of participation or activities, people in activities, but on the other side, you've got almost some acting out that might be discipline related or referral related or not. People as simple as, do we know every child by name in the school beyond the classroom teacher? And how well do we know that? How well do they feel that they're invited to be part of that community, that school community? And how does that fabric start helping bring kids into the network, if you will? And do they believe that the school's there for them and will help them when things get tough? Again, not that you can be everything to everyone, but to what level do you want to do that? And I'm saying there's a really soft side of all this, because the work I've done sometimes is with troubled youth and with kids that end up in really bad situations. And you see that, and I interview those kids, and it happens very young. It didn't happen when they were 19 and they committed a crime. That goes way back. Anyway, I digress, sorry.
But I do have this fear that this is, especially in the scenario we're in now, where so many families in an at-risk category are choosing fully remote, and that kind of kids raising kids scenario is happening because it's a two-parent working family,
Right, tough.
and these kids are at home, and the relationships at school are not being developed, and there's not an anchor for them. And so I feel like all of these things that you worry about in a normal school year are completely heightened right now.
Which no, I was saying, but it's a good example. So like if all your strategic indicators, your key performance indicators were done, right? And let's say they were done prior to this year, right? And now you came in and you were updating, let's say you had a dashboard and you were updating this and looking. So how would you how would you start to know that that's going on? Some of this might have been captured with these engagement ideas that you've talked about. Because one way to think about this is, because what you are doing is you're kind of going in time into the future to your preferred future, whatever vision you have. If this school district looked exactly like the way you wanted it to look in 10 years, like Elmhurst District 205 looks exactly the way that I think it should look 10 years from now, so you're in the future, right? Then what are those indicators, right? And what are the values that you'd like to see on those indicators? I mean, that's how you have to think about this. You have to think about the end in mind. This is the ultimate summative impact of all the efforts of the school system. And what does that look like, right? And what skills do the kids possess? And are they sensitive enough to pick up on when there's problems? So it is a good exercise to say, do the collection of metrics, would these metrics be sensitive enough to be able to identify a profile of student that looks like this, or identify a profile of student that looks like that? Because ultimately, the way that this plays out is once you've identified, the whole idea here is to go from vision and board goals down to individual students. So whatever you come up with here as a Board of Education, as your key performance indicators for student success, right, that represents your vision for student success, you got to operate, that's going to drive the school improvement process, right? So basically, school improvement processes will tie to those. But then you have to measure every single one of those at the individual student level so that you can have triggers and benchmarks built into your operating systems so you can catch. So at the board, you're looking at the aggregate level, but your systems are measuring every single one of these at the student level so that it's sensitive to pick up on the fact that, wow, Johnny wasn't engaged, and now for the last 3 weeks, whatever, now it's falling, and there's an alert, and it's making sure that no students go unnoticed, right? And so whatever these indicators are, they should be sensitive enough to ensure that no kid gets lost, no kid goes unnoticed, and they're sensitive enough to identify when kids are moving in the wrong direction.
I think that's where the growth along the way piece that I was talking about earlier for me plays in. I think that catching those, patterns or downfalls in a particular student and being able to help them along the way. Because I do think, although you might have been referring to some extreme situations, I do think that it doesn't take very long for a kid who is flailing to lose confidence and therefore lose interest and then just start to, have a lack of success. So I think even in those smaller pieces along the way, if we can catch those things and keep those kids giving them the tools they need to move forward and be more successful, then you build that whole child because you're building the confidence so I wholeheartedly agree with that. Being able to catch those things along the way is an important piece of all this. And a lot of the things we're doing, I mean, we have metrics for that already that we just maybe look at differently, but.
Yeah, so my question is, how do you measure those things? And to your point, and to Courtney's point, we're not exempt. We have plenty of families that a kid misses school because they're home with their younger sibling who's sick, because both their parents have to show up at work and they don't have the resources or the mechanism to have an emergency babysitter. And the oldest kid in the family is that emergency babysitter. So how do we capture that? And then also on the extracurricular part and the engagement part, we also have kids. We can probably do a good job of measuring if they're engaged through one of our schools. But we have plenty of kids who are a youth leader at their synagogue and not involved in any of our extracurricular activities, but plenty engaged. Or they're involved in a youth hockey league, and they're plenty engaged, but that youth hockey league has nothing to do with our school district. How do we, in our measurement, capture that activity and be able to count that as yes, those kids are engaged. They're just not engaged with what we're offering, and that's okay.
There's plenty of examples of that where school districts will ask students as part of a process of information gathering from students to indicate outside activities and other participation that they have that are outside the school. So it's not uncommon to see sort of this participation in sponsored co-curricular activities, but separate from that, participation in they'll call it outside activities or non-school sanctioned pieces, but they put mechanisms in place to collect that data.
And how many school districts do you work with that actually manage to get that information onto their students' transcripts? So where that student sends those transcripts gives that institution a better idea of that whole person rather than just a listing of subjects and grades.
Yeah, I don't think at this stage in the game, I don't think many make it way to a formal transcript, but it makes its way into policy conversations around student monitoring and student growth and engagement and everything that we're talking about. So, but it certainly could. I mean, there's nothing that, But I think that's an important, the whole idea of, and more that's happening, where there's just so many opportunities for kids to be engaged outside sanctioned co-curricular activities of the school district, that collecting that data is meaningful.
So, to me, and this is kind of building on one of the things that was mentioned was I don't know, the feeling of that someone knows, someone cares, and if it's the feeling that someone knows, someone cares, then if Jim is involved in his high school, his community hockey, as a teacher, I know Jim, so even though he doesn't participate at school, I know a little bit about Jim, and I know he's involved in some of those things. And if he's stopped his community hockey league, all of a sudden, in my conversation with Jim, I would know that he stopped, and that might be a sign of not being engaged. Right. So it's the idea that everyone somehow feels included. So like the idea came up like of an inclusive community, that piece where we say it, where every kid belongs, we say that, but what does that really look like? How do we make something like that happen? And I don't think it only happens to kids that we consider at risk. It happens to everybody, at one point in time, because every kid's at risk. Every kid's at risk. It's just that they have different support systems in place that help them move forward. So how do we kind of move that needle forward, I guess?
We talked about that relationship piece quite a bit in the winter as we were doing our thought exchange surveys and such. So I know that is a piece where exactly what you're talking about, where those relationships are being built, and then students have a relationship with maybe a particular person in the building that, and different things around that. So I think that's an important thing to continue to look at.
Just to add a piece from our work that Beth is referring to in the fall, our Thrive Detail 5 initiative, how do you track that balance piece for students? There are students who are experts and they have mastered our system in giving us what it looks like to be engaged, and sometimes maybe overly engaged. How do we know where they're balancing out and that they're well and that they are metered and paced to go on beyond here and really be successful in what they want to do?
Oh yeah, it's not really that great. Now you built it up. Actually, I was gonna say, do we want to take a 5-minute quick break? That is the important thing. But just kind of this other little academic piece, we talk about the engagement and the relationships and feeling like they have a place. And then I guess, how do you measure growth? Yes, there's a PSAT. Yes, there's formal testing, but how do you know a kid is growing, a student is growing each semester along the way, so that, you don't, a year doesn't go by and you go, wow, that kid, didn't have any growth. So, and yeah, so that is a question for.
But that's a pretty straightforward. Once you've identified that you want to be tracking academic growth against some definition, it doesn't matter that the assessments are changing or the things are, it's a pretty straightforward analytical task to snap all that into line and articulate that from, elementary all the way through grade 12, so that growth and progress mean the same thing regardless of the assessment you're taking and regardless of the grade level you're at. I mean, that's an analytic task that has to be done, but it's a pretty straightforward task that's widely done in lots of places.
Hey,
Well, I think that, I think that you do start to get into some technical stuff. So when you start to say this is what we're looking for, then you start to take a look, you analyze your curriculum, you look at your assessments, you look at you have the standards. Then you start to get more to the micro level where your specific PLC work and your specific professional learning or whatever the whole system is designed around what you decide are these things that we want to look at, which is what John's getting to, or John's made several points about, it drives everything. Then we can see, do we have the appropriate common formative assessments that are giving us the information to give the kids the feedback, to know if they're getting to the standard, to know if that standard's aligned with the, ultimate AP metrics that you're looking at or whatever it is. So that's kind of ultimately sort of the plan, is to get to that point where we have the big picture conversation now, but then when we nail that down, that's where we drill down and we make sure that everything we do feeds into that.
And it can be well articulated all the way up to where then you have visibility into, are they on track for certain things? Sure.
Well, I mean, that's key for me. I guess that's what I was trying to point out is, we've got third grade. What happens until third grade? I'm sure we're doing great things, but how do we make sure that we're not losing kids along the way? And then from third grade to eighth grade, and then eighth through 12th.
I mean, usually the
So
way that
that's,
this,
I would love to see that every year. This is how they're progressing.
so usually the way this happens is like you start with the end in mind, right? So it's like if you want people here in grade 12, right? I mean, the way that schools are structured, right? You kind of have, there's natural breakpoints, right? So there's where do you want them when they graduate, right? So then where do they need to be entering high school at grade 9? Then you sort of go, where do they need to be entering grade level, in middle school in grade 6? And then you have another break point. Where do they need to be to start sort of elementary school in grade 3? And then you sort of have the early childhood leading up to that, right? But once you've identified where you want them to be when they graduate, then you can articulate those benchmarks down to say, okay, this is the benchmark then for 9, 6, 3, K-12. And then within that, then you can articulate all those growth metrics up to each one of those milestones. And then what you end up with is a fully articulated system so that at every stage, you know exactly whether or not a student is on the trajectory to ultimately be on track to get there years down the road. And so it's an analytical task, but it's a task that's very doable. It's work, of course, but.
I know, sorry, Martha.
Okay, so we're gonna re-engage here, and we have till 7:45 to get some consensus on these major areas. So where we are is we have a vision of college, career, and life readiness as a single construct, right? That really is subdivided. And we're talking about student success. We're defining student success as areas and indicators that are observable and can be tracked down to the individual student level, right? And at this point, we have academics. And by academics, we're talking about proficiency, we're talking about growth, we're talking at the high school level about post-secondary experiences, and we're talking about some early childhood pieces. This is sort of where we are. So, separate from that, we have a communication and collaboration piece that takes in a lot of things around speaking and writing and collaborating and working in groups and teamwork and those kind of ideas. We have an engagement component that's taking into account, are students connected? Are they engaged? Are they? And some of the ideas we have around that are tracking attendance and discipline and missing work and participation in co-curricular activities, both in sanctioned sort of school things and outside of school official co-curriculars, class participation, communication with teachers and parents, just to give you sort of a working definition of what we're talking about. And then we also have a character and citizenship sort of placeholder, which took into account these ideas of community service, character, citizenship, service learning, those kinds of ideas. So right now we have 4 working buckets: academics, communication, collaboration, engagement, character, and citizenship. Those are the 4 that we have. The thing I would pose to the group as we try to round this out before things that I think need to be addressed somewhere, just given what I've seen. It doesn't mean it needs to be a bucket, it just has to be kind of a recognition of how we're thinking about it, right? Is the whole conversation of equity is probably something that we could talk about in terms of this. Now, there's different ways that districts do this, but I think it's at least something that I'm just throwing out pieces that you may want to think about. There's that equity piece, and then there's the whole social emotional competencies piece, which is in parts of these, right? So if I was to say how do districts approach this, right? Some of them will try to pull it out into its own thing called social emotional competencies and then try to drop everything underneath it. Others will try to embed it within other headings. The same thing goes for the whole equity and access conversation. Some districts will sort of pull it out and have a bucket for equity, but then other districts will actually think more systemically and say, well, equity and access is about everything, so we address that just based on the way we analyze the data and the way that we report the data. So, and I can give you examples of that, but just those are the 2 areas that I would just get you to think about whether or how they belong in this at all, and whether or not there's other pieces that are missing. So with that, I'll open it back up.
So I think what we need to know is, are you in agreement that as we move forward into next steps, that we want to build our indicators off of these 4 areas with the key concepts of equity and social emotional wellness reflected in the work somewhere? Because if we know that, then we can start to get to the
Absolutely.
next level of conversation.
Absolutely.
Are we talking now about the equity? And I do think the equity piece and the social emotional piece should be interwoven into all of these things, because I think they affect every one of them. So I just didn't know if we were making that decision now, or if that's something that's the next step of the conversation.
No, I think that's a decision you should make now, because it goes to the structure of how you think about the indicators. And so if there's consensus on equity should basically be cutting across everything, and it's about how, when we get to the more granular conversation around the actual metric, the actual benchmark, and how that data will be reported, you could address equity there. Because it's actually really easy I think it's easier to address equity through analysis protocols and reporting protocols than it is to try to define it as something separate. because that gets at whether or not, like a perfect example of it, like the classic example of this is, you talk about AP participation, right, as one of your indicators. And so, the equity piece is, are certain subgroups of students, that have demonstrated that they have a capacity to do well in those courses, actually getting the opportunity to be in those courses. So the way you do that is, you can look at the distribution of certain subgroups within those courses against what your populations to be, and what the number of students that have sort of AP potential, if you will. And through analysis, you can get at that.
So let me just understand that. So equity that in this scenario does not mean equity across all students. It means equity within the group of students that could potentially take those classes.
So, equity means a lot of things.
Right,
So,
that's what I mean. In this scenario, that's what you mean?
in this scenario, in the example I gave, equity means, do all subgroups have equal access to certain kinds of programming, given that they have something in their profile that demonstrates that they have a reasonable expectation of doing well in that course.
So remember what I was saying before about students with disabilities having the majority of their classes in general education environment. It's a similar sort of measure there. So do students with disabilities or students of color or students from low income backgrounds, did they take our AP courses at the same participation rates as their, measures in our district? And what does that really look like?
It probably comes to no surprise. I could give you so many examples in so many different places. When you start talking about I'm just going to call it advanced programming, whether it's like a gifted program at the early elements or whether it's AP at the high school, right? That if you were to sometimes, especially at the earlier grades, if you were to actually look at the academic profiles of the students that are in and the students that are out, you'll scratch your head and say, how are all these students excluded, but all these students are included, when if you were to look at face value the academic profile, it would suggest that a lot more should be in there, or some should. So it's an example, but.
And I think, John, part of what I think Courtney is saying, just to maybe take it maybe a step further than what you said, is that to create a system where it's not just about if they have something in their profile, then we make sure they have access, but we identify early enough to try to ensure that virtually all students do have the opportunity to get into certain opportunities. That they may think, going back to that, getting discouraged at a younger age, that they may have been conditioned to think over time, well, I just can't do this.
That's right. That's right. But a lot of it, if you have good indicators, a lot of that can be facilitated just through data analysis and reporting. It doesn't necessarily have to be an indicator in and of itself, right? Because you could do it for all indicators, but you could analyze data in a specific way. So you're looking at the overall value of the indicator, but then you're also looking at the same indicator through a lens of equity and access, where appropriate. It's a more systemic way to kind of cut across it all, as opposed to carve it out and call equity this indicator. Now, but people do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But it sounds like the consensus here is to think about the equity and access pieces more systemically across everything where applicable, and not try to pull it out and try to define it as a single thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think it should become a mindset that we're always that you're always thinking about that equity piece in everything that is happening in the organization, also the social emotional piece. It's not a separate track.
Okay. That's a big decision.
So with that being said, then, we've had, over the course of the night, several people ask questions about, well, what are some of the things that you could measure, or what are some of these things that relate to this area? So Steve has a handout that we're going to give you to take a look at that gives you some examples of the types of indicators that you could identify for Elmhurst related to these major areas that you now have said you think are important.
I mean, they're not organized by that, but what this is just sort of a collection of things that we've experienced in lots of districts, just examples. So just try to get your, your thoughts working. And you may notice something on here that you don't feel like is reflected.
Can you just repeat those buckets,
The working buckets we have right now is academics,
Yep,
and within that, we have proficiency, growth, and I'm going to call it sort of access to advanced programming, because at the secondary level, that would be the whole AP
Yep.
conversation. At the elementary level, it could be other advanced programming. And then we have the early childhood piece of that. So academics, communication and collaboration, engagement, character, and citizenship. We have 4 main areas. So the question that I would pose is, does that feel right to you, given Elmhurst and your vision for College, Career, and Life Ready? Does thinking about that through the lens of academics, communication, collaboration, engagement, and character, and citizenship, does that feel right?
I assume learning skills would fall under the academics piece, like, study skills and, what's the term everybody uses for, executive functioning, yes, thank you. Things like that, I assume that would fall under, so that's college and career ready, that they're prepared
But
to.
I'll make a note, so executive function is something that needs to go, that you think that idea is missing, so potentially missing.
I just would like to see that personally somewhere, so that if we want them to be ready for, as they move along for the next steps and then college or whatever they decide to do, that those learning skills, I think, are important.
Now, John and Steve, I'm thinking that's SEL.
What's that?
I'm thinking it's SEL.
It is.
Socially, okay.
It is.
Okay.
Which
It's
is
a
kind
matter of how you
embedded in
organize it, though.
So we're on the same page then, that, so just like you said, the equity and access would be the systemic piece, the SEL would be systemic too?
Well, that's a question, I guess.
That the SEL, social emotional learning, which would be the executive functions and all that, would be systemic too throughout.
That's, I mean, you could go,
So I'm thinking that I heard before that people seem to agree that both of these should be things that are embedded in everything that we do.
when you separate, should we put we have the 6 Cs, and I think we kind of separated citizenship out or some, I mean, and I'm asking this to my peers, should it be kind of, you've got the academics, the 6 Cs, the engagement, and then embedded in those are the equity and the SEL? Have I missed anything?
Yes, I like moving that citizenship over.
We just, we talk about the 6 Cs, and then I think in the buckets we kind of separated to 2. I don't know, maybe I could be wrong.
are you saying you like the 6 Cs framework?
Well, there's 2,
Put two of the Cs in one
Do you know what
bucket
I'm-
and took citizenship out, so we have 2 separate buckets.
So I think that one option would be to have 3 areas and put the 6 Cs together. Or if you like the idea of separating them out the way they currently are, we could build creativity and critical thinking into the academic piece somehow, possibly.
basically,
Oh, I
I'd
see
just
what
like
you
to
mean.
see those other
I see what you mean, like
Cs
wrapping
in
the
there
6
somehow.
Cs is like take communication, collaboration, move, character, citizen, call it all the 6 Cs, you're saying.
It seems weird that they're separated out.
And then we're missing 2, right?
3.
Yeah, or 3, or,
Yeah.
yeah.
To make sure that they're all represented, exactly.
So,
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of having the 3 buckets and just have the 6 Cs in that one.
Can you pull the thing down a little bit? It's literally kind of
It was a test to see if we remembered the other two Cs.
Because, yeah, then that would bring it down to 3. You'd have academics, the 6 Cs, and engagement.
The SEL would be part of all of them, really. And what was the other thing you said that would be part of them? Equity. Thank you. I was thinking assessment, I might know this one.
Because all those 60s, like, I feel like go a lot to what Jim was saying about the, the career ready, like the career skills, collaboration, critical thinking, and then also actually some of the SEL skills, right? Being on time, being, whatever. Emotional, but.
That makes sense to me.
So just repeat then so I think we have collaboration and communication in there, then we have character and citizenship separated out. So are you saying what is our final?
I think what I understood was really we're defining it in 3 major buckets. Academics, a construct of the 6 Cs, which represents sort of this 21st century learning ideas of communication, collaboration, character, citizenship, critical thinking, and then engagement. So you'd have academics, I'm just gonna say the 6 Cs, we can talk about what they actually call it, and then engagement. So the idea being that being college, career, and life ready is to have strong academics, strong aptitude in the 6 Cs, and to be engaged.
I like that. The only hesitation that I have is sometimes aren't some of those 6 Cs embedded in SEL. And so I just want to make sure if we go down this path, and we might not know tonight, but we have several people that are working with that in the district to kind of get their ideas to see, will it be confusing or not? I'd like it to be clear, and I think this could be clear, but that's just a side note for me, a yellow flag to get clarification to make sure.
So my response, Karen, to that is I think that's a fair concern with both equity and SEL is until we get massage this and everybody has a better idea of where these types of things emerge once we take it to the next step. But I think that the same question would be there if we had it separated out as if we put them together. And I think that what we are currently trying to do, I think that this is consistent. It won't be a drastic departure for teachers, or it will build on the work that we're already doing. The language is familiar, things like that. So I think that we can make sure that there are some natural fits in the areas where it works.
So I understand it's the social emotional piece that you feel like is not visible enough? Is that?
No, that's not it. Dave addressed it. I think we're good.
Margaret, do you? Yeah, the one thing, and I was just, the more it came around, hearing others talk about this, it to me, it fits our initial ideal of college, career, and life. Because I'm thinking college is typically, or that advanced learning is that academic piece. Career is really those 6 Cs. It's the collaboration. It's all those things when you're in the work world, all the things that you're expected to be able to deliver on, working with each other, being able to think through problem solving, all those different pieces. And then the life is, are you out there participating? Are you engaged? Are you actively, involved? And I think that fits our buckets of college, career, and life pretty good.
Without calling it that. But you're
Without
not,
calling
you're
it
right.
that.
James?
Do we need a bucket for, first the financial and physical operation of the district, and we've made no mention of the people that work here.
So you're gonna need, yeah, so there's two layers of buckets here that you're gonna need. So you're gonna need a top layer, you're gonna need more buckets on the top layer. So meaning that, so we just did student success, right? So you're gonna definitely need some kind of learning environment, finance and operations, culture, community relations for sure.
So I think we're ready to kind of bring this to a close. Are we comfortable if we wrap it up and sort of get some closure here and talk about next steps a little bit? So,
It's only 7:45. I feel like we need to go overtime, just to. No. You know. The heat, yeah. No,
So-
go ahead. We're running. Look at you, just gonna keep on talking. All right, go
So
ahead.
one of the reasons that we did these 100-day plans is because we wanted to get more specificity into the school improvement planning process. And we wanted them to be able to focus more on some very specific outcomes that is similar to the concept that we all talked about today. But we didn't have this last year like we had hoped. And so what we did is we took those 100-day plan concepts, put it in the operational plan as a placeholder because we didn't have anything else. Ideally, what we want to do is construct this operational plan where these are our outcomes and we have our strategic indicators and we identify some annual focus areas based on our data, and then the schools will write their school improvement plans and they will write 100-day plans to reflect your big goals. And that's the way we hope to start to narrow that funnel down into the classroom level eventually as we move along. So what we were thinking about, what we conceptualized here at the outset was that we would build off of this and come back to this with kind of a part 2 conversation where Mary Ann would work with the ECRA people a little bit and construct some draft strategic indicators to support these areas that you agreed to, and then come back at a second retreat and actually get your approval that these are the options for how you write these things. These are what we want them to be. This is going to be our new KPIs. Some of them will look similar to existing KPIs, as we said before. And then that would form the basis of the operational plan that we would, when we do our operational plan revisions and bring those forward to you going forward, starting next year, those would be our new KPIs. And so what we would like to do is schedule a second retreat. I mean, we don't have to do that tonight, but we want to give them some time to work on getting some indicators around these areas and then come back and have you look at them and make sure that they're what you want. And then when we have that nailed down, we could have another conversation about how do we want to get into the community engagement or the other organizational factors that the board, the governance types of things that are our board work that you want to see part of our overall reporting system. And those will also then become parts of the future operational plan, so that then every time we have a board meeting, essentially, those are the things that you're all focusing in on, and you've achieved consensus that those are the things you want us to be looking at, measuring, reporting, communicating, et cetera. So does that make sense to everybody conceptually? I mean, it's not difficult by any means, but I also want to make sure that everybody's on the same page so that we're not working at cross purposes when we walk out. So that's what we'll do. All right, so I think The workshop part of it's done. You have some public comment, or you want to close it out however you want here?
Can you just give a little, like, these are just ideas, right?
Yeah, this was
Like,
just meant to just give
for us
ideas,
to
thought
think
provoking,
about going into
what
the
we've
next
seen in other
conversation.
places.
Okay.
Right, this is just kind of,
Okay. All right, so any other questions?
Yeah, let me
before-
just say one thing about that then, since, I mean, you haven't had a lot of time to process these, and I can give you examples of dashboards and graduate profiles and other things from other districts. We actually did touch on that very late in the evening last February one night to try to, we've been sort of trying to get to this conversation for a while, as Kara alluded to at the beginning. So if you have any feedback on some of these things that you see, like if you like some of these ideas and you want to let me know, then we can take that into account when we start putting the indicators together.
Kara? It was interesting, remote learning is the top here, because I did go into this meeting thinking, I've got two hats on. One is, pre-COVID and post-COVID, but one is during COVID with remote learning. And, it's like, how do we measure our students irregardless of what environment we're in? But, we really, if there's some way, if there's anything unique that we need to measure during remote learning, I think that we should think about that, even if it's a temporary thing or something that you turn on and off at points in time.
Yeah, this was interesting to see these here. We actually can give ourselves a pat on the back. We are doing a lot of these, and we have these. The virtual meetings, we don't disaggregate, but that jumped out to me, and I was actually going to annoy Marianne and RJ with an email on that. But I thought that would be an interesting data point for us to share, and Zoom really does provide that information for us in a nice one-stop shop. The social emotional wellness is something that we can work to include more on in our upcoming survey. We're anticipating that mid-October. And I think that will get to some of that now that we've got a little bit more under our belts in terms of the actual instructional piece. But the rest of those, we do have some real good data points on, including the hotspots that we're working through, even meal distribution, attendance. So this was great. This was validating to see and sort of sparked a couple ideas as well. So thanks for sharing this.
And then Dave, or John, so the next time will we kind of do those bigger, like this one was really, we talked about student success and what we want to hone in on. Next time we'll get into the finance and facilities or whatever those other big buckets would be that are above student,
yeah, I think we could talk with Dave, however you want to structure the ones going forward. I would think you'd need
obviously
a little conversation on just what those other buckets are, and then you'd kind of have to schedule, I think, sometimes to work on. The other ones tend to be easier, I got to tell you, than the student piece. You might be able to bang them all out in one session.
Yeah.
I think maybe we can begin that conversation as a starting point to move forward. And we can structure it really however you want, but I think that we have to get some agreement on the strategic indicators. So we can't leave that hanging. I think we have to come back to that.
Yeah. And that could happen. There's a lot of it. We can follow up on what the best way to do that is.
Okay, anything else? You guys good?
I'm good.
Okay. Okay, so we have public comments to do left to do for up to an hour. Submissions received before 5:30 on the day of the meeting will be read aloud or summarized after stating the name of the author. Comments received before 5:30, which are not read aloud or summarized, and received after 5:30 will be reviewed by board members. All submissions received will be made available publicly on the district's website. And the link was available in board docs to post a comment. Mrs. Troutman, you read those?
Yes. The first comment is anonymous. At last week's board meeting, Dr. Rubenstein explained the COVID metrics. At that time, the public was told that there would be a COVID dashboard going live on Friday. There is still no information regarding getting this up and running. In addition, Dr. Rubenstein explained that one of the criteria looked at for schools to return to full remote instruction was the number of cases per 100,000. As of today, according to Northwestern University's dashboard that provides statistics by zip code, shows Elmhurst cases per 100,000 is at 207. This is double what we were told the metric would need to be to return to remote instruction. In addition, the rolling average for the positivity rate is just over 8%. How are schools still open? It doesn't matter what the county metrics are at this point. Elmhurst's numbers are out of control. There are many students and staff currently quarantined. The buildings are not adequately staffed. At one of our middle schools tomorrow, there's a sub combining 2 classes at once due to overlap and no subs. These are not acceptable conditions for our children or the district staff. At what point is the district administration and the Board of Education going to realize that we are not ready to return to in-person learning? The largest group yet, our 8th and 11th and 12th graders, have not even returned. Will the board and administration consider a return to remote learning platform only when a student or staff member gets seriously ill from COVID-19 or even worse, dies from complications? This is absolutely ridiculous. The next comment is from the Martinez family. My family was disappointed to hear elementary Spanish was canceled for this year or part of it. While we certainly understand the staffing issues surrounding this, my family's expectation is that the program be fully reinstated in the fall of 2021 at the latest. As a family, we know that studying a foreign language raises standardized test scores and will facilitate getting a job done in the future. Spanish is not just one of life's it's critical. It is also part of the family heritage, and we love that our community is more accepting of diversity through studying Spanish. We are hopeful for our children to someday earn the seal of biliteracy in high school. We understand the success of the Spanish program is dependent upon beginning the language at a young age. We chose this district for the unique foreign language opportunities, and friends and neighbors have always spoken very highly of the value of the ACP program, which will be in jeopardy if elementary Spanish is ended. Please ensure the elementary Spanish program is restored next fall. Thank you for all your hard work this fall for the children. That's it.
Thank you. All right, we have 3 upcoming meetings. October 8th, 2020 is a Finance and Operations Committee meeting here at 5:30. October 13th, 2020 is a regularly scheduled Board of Education meeting here at 7 o'clock. And October 27th, 2020, regularly scheduled Board of Education meeting here at 7 o'clock. And with that, if no one has anything else, we are adjourned. Thank you.